Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today in this MyFest 23 session. It is our own pleasure and to have Glenda joining us talking about open textbooks and how she co-creates with students. And we don't like I'm gonna give the floor to Glenda to just introduce herself and her work and her title, and then she can start with the session content. Thank you, and over to you, Glenda.
Great. So because we have a small group, it would really be nice if just for a moment, if you could just, you don't have to pop your camera on, that's unless you want to, but just to say where you are from, and you know, university and perhaps what you teach or what you're involved in. And if you are interested in creating an open textbook or co-creating. Kathy, could we start with you? Kathy?
Of course, if people, I'm sorry, Glenda, but if people are not open to unmute, can they use the chat for more comfort?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. Welcome to just introduce yourselves in the chat.
In the chat, yeah.
Okay.
Because they understand that it might not be.
Okay.
Might not. Okay.
Would anyone like to introduce themselves?
I don't know, but people sometimes have problems opening the mics or something, so they can use the chat like that.
Okay. Irene?
I could start. My name is Irene Maweo. I live at the coast of Kenya, a town or city called Malindi, and I'm a facilitator and of course consultant. And one of the big projects that I do is a course offered by the Emerge Africa, which is a project where Glenda is at the University of Cape Town under the Center for Innovation, Learning and Teaching. Usually I mix up.
That's great. I think, yeah, we will be.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I do, but I love meeting new people. I love facilitation. I love being here. So I'm happy. Thank you. Thank you, Glenda, for letting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else like to just come in? Okay, go ahead.
I'm Danielle Dubé. I am a curriculum developer in Saskatchewan at Saskatchewan Polytechnic, and I'm developing online courses for the trades. So that comes with its own challenges with respect to online education in higher education.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. Anyone else happy to introduce themselves? We will be chatting more to each other as the session goes along, I hope. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen. Hoping that's fine and visible. Everybody can see my screen. Yeah, Yasha, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Awesome, great. Okay, wonderful. Then we just go to slideshow because I think it's easier to see what's happening. Great. Okay, so I think the title and the advert was a little bit longer than this, and you'll see when I'm talking, I'm going to cover quite a lot of different issues around student co-creation and student belonging and changing power balance in higher education. So this presentation is set in a higher education setting, and I'm hoping that I'm going to share a lot of lessons that I've learned since sort of working in open textbooks for quite a while. And also that link that's in the chat is a very early version of a kind of guidelines framework that we've been thinking about. And so I'm kind of testing it out on you. So any kind of feedback will be really useful. And hopefully it'll be a resource that you can keep with you if you think about doing this kind of work in the future. So if you have a look at the icons at the bottom, on the left is the Digital Open Textbooks for Development project. That's where I am. next to that is the Center for Innovation in Learning and Teaching that Irene just spoke about now. In the middle, the Global OER Graduate Network. I'm a very proud alumni. That's a wonderful network for anyone who is thinking about doing a PhD in open education. They have an incredible network of expertise there. I also currently hold a UNESCO chair in open education and social justice, and that chair is held at the University of Cape Town, and I am responsible for it. So that's a little background. So today we'll do some slides, but hopefully we can have some interaction in between time when you'll be looking at that document. I can always share it again later, and having kind of, I think, probably sessions, not breakout sessions, because we are quite a small group, but feedback to the group. We'll be talking about co-creation, looking at frameworks for understanding co-creation, and then a little bit at the end around attribution and recognition, very important. And as I said, there is that link to the Google Doc. Don't worry about it right now. When I get to the activity, I'll share it again in case you haven't been able to access it. So I've been working in open education since around 2010. So I suppose I've built up a little bit of expertise over that time. And these are photos, a lot of them with other people. And I think that that's been such an exciting process to get to know other open educators and be part of some really interesting initiatives and work across the Global South. And more recently, the work that I've been doing with UNESCO, which started at the beginning of last year. So exciting networks that I've managed to build over the years. And I just love the open education community because they are just so friendly and I suppose inviting, and it's a community that you can really rely on. That's my community. So the University of Cape Town, you can see the main campus here. We have a few different campuses. This is the main upper campus, it's called. And it is situated on the slopes of this mountain. The mountain is called Devil's Peak. It's a very pretty campus, as you can see. Around about 28,500 students. It's a residential institute, so not necessarily online, although we do have some online courses. And you can see there the number of staff. So just a kind of medium-sized institution, I would say. And the project that we have learned all these lessons from is called the Digital Open Textbooks for Development Project. And these are my two wonderful colleagues, Michelle and Bianca. And we have been implementing open textbooks at UCT through giving academics grants. We've been researching open textbooks and also doing advocacy work over the last few years. As you might know from your own institutions, a lot of these kinds of projects are soft funded externally, and then the money runs out and there just isn't the same kind of momentum. And we're very fortunate in that we all now have permanent jobs at UCT, and we all have a component of our jobs that is dedicated to open education. So that was very exciting for us. That happened quite recently at the beginning of last year. Great. So the first part of this kind of discussion is around addressing and talking about open education, first of all, with some definitions. And I'm kind of sensing that, and I know Danielle and I know Irene will already have a sense of what open education is, but we'll run through some definitions quickly, and then get into the nitty-gritty of talking about what co-creation is about. So open education, There are a number of different definitions. You can choose one that kind of makes sense for you. I quite like this one because it talks about encompassing not only resources, but also tools and practices. Very importantly, all of these different aspects are freely and openly licensed. That's a key aspect of open education, this idea of open licensing. And what open education does is it maximizes the power of the internet so that more people can have equitable access to resources. The open textbook specifically, so that's the kind of case that I'm going to be talking about. And perhaps in your experience, you haven't really thought about an open textbook, but maybe you've thought about open teaching materials. So an open textbook is an example of open teaching materials. And it's usually digital, doesn't have to be, but mostly it is. Often you can have affordance to have it printed out. But what we've seen is the open textbook or chapters that people have created are usually around a specific course. So it needs to be scaffolded. It's under an open license, as I said. And it has these amazing affordances to engage students in collaborative, inclusive authorship, quality assurance, and publishing. And other authors, obviously, but specifically we're talking about student co-creation here. And then it also has this affordance to integrate all kinds of different multimedia, third-party content. And because these different cases or examples or multimedia can be brought into the textbook, we get a wide range of epistemic representation. So open education practices, a definition by Catherine Cronin, who's done some amazing work on open education practice. So she talks about the creation, use, and reuse of open education resources, as well as open pedagogy and open sharing of teaching. So that was a little backdrop to this idea of open education and what it means. And when we started doing this work, we started to think about the role of open textbooks. What was the purpose of open textbooks and how could we make a really good argument for why they were useful? And when we did the initial proposal around 2017, 2018, a lot of this work around social justice was emerging increasingly in the open education arena. And subsequently, a lot of very interesting special issues and books have been published using social justice as a framework to understanding open education and resources and textbooks. So there's a lot of literature out there if you're interested in reading more. The specific definition of social justice that I want to introduce here, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail around the theory, but we refer to the work of Nancy Fraser. And she has this concept that she calls participatory parity. So she says that social justice is a concept that requires the organization of social arrangements to make it possible for everyone to participate equally in society. So I really quite like that definition. We often talk about what is just, what is social justice, but don't always give a definition. And she also carries on to explain that it's a complex and that it has various dimensions, economic, political, and cultural. And all of these need to be addressed to actually get to that point of participatory parity. So we've used social justice as a framework to understand the potential of open education. And the underlying principles of open education build on this idea of social justice. And the intention of open education is to provide affordable access to culturally relevant education to all. And so this diagram kind of brings together these three aspects that we've been talking about: social justice, open education, and open textbooks. And we've kind of made this argument around how economically open education is providing free resources through open licensing, that culturally it provides this amazing opportunity for localization, multilingualism, and especially the open textbook, where you can adapt what's there. And then political representation is all about voice and representing voice that had been repressed in the past or misframed. And so open education provides an opportunity for collaborators and students to be drawn in as part of a co-creation process. So that's kind of the kind of argument we've been building and thinking about quite a bit over the last few years. And so in some of the work that we've been doing, we've made quite a clear argument, certainly in our local context in South Africa, where we had very strong student protests starting in around 2014. And the students were talking about three key aspects. They were talking about fees must fall, where they wanted free education. They talked about cultural recognition, where there was the removal of statues and symbols of colonization, like Cecil John Rhodes was actually in front of the university. So thinking about cultural recognition, and then also this drive to decolonize texts and include voices. And so we could actually see how the open textbook was addressing some of these calls for justice. Okay, so that's a little bit about the background, and you'll see in the first activity, we'll be thinking about what the purpose would be if you were thinking about doing student creation, whether it's a co-creation, whether it's open textbooks, or perhaps as an activity in your class, or to create a teaching material. There are lots of different ways of including students in this process. My example is open textbooks. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's something that you'll be doing. And so there are lots of ways of thinking about this, and how we can bring students into co-creation. And so we've seen examples of that a whole class is included. We've seen examples where just part of the class is included. So just a few students are selectively invited to be part of co-creation. We've seen other examples of an open invitation. So you're all invited in. You know, if you want to be part of this, you can. There are other aspects. So although I'm saying textbook, it could be before the class, before whatever it is that you want to produce or create. So before, in the actual process, let's say in the classroom or in the textbook production, and then also after the textbook. So do you want students to be involved after it in sort of a qualitative or quality assurance kind of way? So something to think about. If you're thinking about co-creating, how would you do this as a very kind of basic class involvement approach? When we were trying to understand co-creation, we went into a whole new body of literature. And there is a lot written on how academics have co-created with students. And there's a big students as partners field of literature that is growing overseas, with a journal dedicated to it with that title, and other journals that also look at student co-creation. So there's a lot of very interesting work that you can look at if you're interested in following up on this. But when we were looking at trying to understand how our open textbook authors were co-creating, we kind of felt it would be really useful to go to experts and read their work and see if we could find a kind of framework that we could work with. So not invent our own, but rather draw on the experience and expertise of others. And so we found the work of Catherine Bovill from the University of Edinburgh. And she has developed this framework to illustrate student partnership. So we explored her model. And so she has different ways of dividing up how students work with staff, but a lot of it has to do with kind of agency and just how much kind of power students have in the situations and how much they are involved. So she starts off with two kind of more light touch approaches: participatory design, where students are involved in design and development, but more kind of like testers or informants, not really with a high level of agency. And then she talks about engagement. So activities that students could do, but like more of a motivation kind of thing, more kind of to get students interested. And so we took these different categories and applied them to the open textbooks that we had in order to kind of try and develop different kinds of like models of open textbook creation. So here you can see two examples. We've got examples from all disciplines. Mechanical engineering and surgery are the two examples here. And we see how authors have included colleagues and students, but kind of in a light touch sense way. So we had examples of authors who just use students for very specific things. And we'll see we had examples where students were used more intensively. Then she has this category called co-creation. And here she's talking about empowerment of students and meaningful engagements, and how students can construct understanding and learning. And then she divides that into smaller categories. So she talks about representative. So you'll remember earlier I mentioned a part of the class, so not the whole class, but an elected group. She talks about students that are consultants, that are paid for the work that they do. Co-researchers who are actually doing teaching and learning research or subject-based research, and co-designers, so students who are sharing responsibility for designing. And when we looked at our open textbook, we got a great example from the Marketing to South African Consumers, where colleagues and students were included in the co-design and authorship of work. And then the final category, which is like the epitome of the co-creation categories, is partnership. Okay, so collaborating, contributing equally, joint conceptualization and decision making. And so it's kind of this bright pink. But what you'll see here is that we have great examples of this happening with colleagues, but not exactly with students. Okay, and we'll talk about this later as we talk about this idea of partnership, but also the idea of power, and the idea of academics as the expert and students still not really taking on that equal expertise role. But we do see exciting examples of authorship, co-creation, co-researcher, so multiple different ways of bringing students in to the authorship process, but also in quality assurance. So giving feedback, checking, making sure the content was relevant. So very interesting ways of bringing students in quite deep ways. So we were really quite excited to see what actually had been happening in these open textbooks. So lots to think about. So what I wanted to do to start off with is to have a little activity now. And I know we're quite a small group, so I don't think we need to do any kind of breakout rooms. I think what I'd like you to do is to have a look at the Google Doc. And you'll see in the Google Doc, it says activity 1, and there are little categories that you can fill in. You can decide how you want to do this. You can work in the document, you can download the document separately. However it works for you, work on another screen independently. You don't necessarily have to show us what you're doing, but we will be talking about it. So firstly, what is the purpose of your open textbook? So we talked about social justice, we talked about saving money for students, we talked about localization, multilingualism, curriculum change, decolonization. Why would you want to bring students in? So if it's an open textbook, that's fine. But also, let's say, for example, you're not thinking about open textbook, but you're thinking about co-creation with students in your classroom. What is the purpose? And then a little bit about the context. So, how would you do this? Would you do the whole class, part of the class, and so on? And then I've also put in kind of layers of where you could be thinking about Bovell's framework. So how would you think about including students? Are you thinking about more of a light touch engagement, or are you thinking about ways of truly bringing students in as partners? Okay, so I'm going to just stop sharing for now. If I can do that, stop share. Yeah, great. Okay. Has everybody managed to find the Google Doc? Have you got the link for that? Hi, Aliyah.
Hello, Glenda. Hello, everyone.
Hello. Nice to have you here.
Thank you. I actually joined late. Oh, thanks, Irene. She just sent the link. I'll check it out now.
Okay, great. Okay, so just having a look here. So this is what it looks like. And there's a bit of information in the document first, but then there's also kind of these areas where I thought it would be really nice if you could kind of sit just quietly for 5 minutes or so, and just kind of think through the different categories. Why would you want to do this? How you're thinking of getting the class involved. And then a little bit about the sort of depth of that kind of involvement. And yeah, I'm going to give you sort of about 5 minutes or so. It's 16:30 for me, but yeah, so just about 5 minutes to 16:35, whatever your time zone is. And then we're going to just sort of bring that back into the classroom, or into the session rather, and just talk about what you've been thinking. Are there any questions at this stage? Please go ahead and ask. It's just a few of us, so it'll be really nice if you do have questions, if you can ask. And yeah, I know you started a little late. Are you okay?
Yes, I'm checking the Google Doc out. So basically, we're thinking of ways that we can involve the whole class in light of having open textbooks or open education. Is that right?
It doesn't have to be the whole class. You could have different strategy. So you could just want 1 or 2 students, or yeah, so it doesn't have to be the whole class. You can be thinking about what you want to do. I mean, perhaps you want to translate materials, in which case you might just want 3 students who would be able to help you with that. So think of kind of possible scenarios that that might be a real imperative for you.
Okay.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so I was basically brainstorming this in my head rather than writing it down anywhere. But I was basically thinking that perhaps an issue that could be addressed as multilingualism where especially if we're in a classroom where students come from different backgrounds and different cultural contexts and different nationalities, etc. So they can basically participate in co-creating the curriculum or the textbook at hand for the course, whereby they get to choose as well the language of instruction, or because I know that several students, especially if they talk multiple languages, at least this could be the case for some of us or for myself as well. We sort of have a language of preference, or one language out of the others that we feel more comfortable speaking with, talking, doing the work with, communicating with others with. So I feel that this can be an issue to be addressed in the class, where they co-create a textbook based on the languages of their preference. And then the curriculum and instructional design and practices can be designed or created accordingly based on their preferences as well. And then they can all collaborate together to create this, along with the help of the professor, of course, or the teaching assistant or whatever. And this way, this can be through the involvement of the whole class rather than partial. So it's a whole class thing. And in terms of so it's kind of like a participatory design in this case, addressing multilingualism. Again, it involves some engagement as well in the process, because they're all engaged with the language of their preference, or the one they feel more comfortable with. And so they can be seen as co-creators, co-authors, where everyone is involved, not only the professor or the teaching assistant, but the students as well, from various backgrounds, nationalities.
Great. Aliyah, did you say where you're from?
I'm from Egypt.
Oh, you're also from Egypt. Great, wonderful. Great. So also multilingual environment where you do come in with.
True.
Yeah.
In our case, for example, in a classroom, we can have English as a language of instruction, but there may be other students who prefer to speak and learn in Arabic, or
Sure.
vice versa. So we have to kind of take all languages and backgrounds into consideration.
That's great. Okay. Great. That's excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ganya, would you like to share some of your thoughts?
Well, so coming from Canada, for us, multilingualism usually involves French and English. And what that can mean is, if you have students from abroad, then you can have people speaking a whole bunch of ways of French and a whole bunch of ways of English. What I have found also is multilingualism in STEM courses is far easier to manage than multilingualism in non-STEM courses, because in STEM you have defined terms and they have to have fixed terms, they have to have fixed meanings. Whereas when you're non-STEM courses, then just even if everybody spoke the exact same version of English, we'd still be having long discussions about how we define a certain term. And so multilingualism in non-STEM courses could be more of a challenge. When it comes to curriculum change, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how students could be involved in that. I guess it depends on what the institution allows, what the teacher allows, what is needed for a program. And where I get concerned about curriculum change is, suppose you have an institution that does not do thorough program design. So you don't have someone like an instructional designer advising at the level of a program. And so what you have, you might have a teacher who introduces this idea of curriculum change, and the students give input, but it doesn't take into account other courses that relate to this course. Then that can be wonderful, or it can disrupt the whole program. So if curriculum change is being done, I wonder if it's done within thinking of program design, or if it's completely radical. Maybe it's a one-off course and it has no bearing on other courses. So I think these are things to consider. For affordable access, I think increasingly that's a concern, but I worry that affordability and simple access is prized over other issues, like you were talking about representation and are minorities properly representing themselves. I'll only talk about one more aspect, which is in your first area of activity 1, the purpose and context. So a few things to consider about, well, in the other category, I suppose, is what are your purposes? Well, is this a situation where content is king, where you're getting students together just to build the basics, most essential content for the course? Are you doing that? So are you working from scratch? Or are you working from something that already exists, and so you're improving it in some way? So you've already got the most essential stuff, and now you're adding, you're enriching, you're making it the ideal version of what it could be. Or are you inserting values into it rather than having sterile content that is completely accurate and factual? Are you now adding something else to it? Are you making it more into a fictionalized version to make it perhaps more appealing? Are you adding certain values in it, like hierarchical values or open how can I say, innovative ideas? Like, are you allowing, like, what kind of values are being put into the material? Or are you contextualizing the material? So I think these are very different approaches to building textbooks.
That's great. Great. Irene, what have you been thinking?
I think towards Alia's way of thinking, the multilingualism, because of course, we, like she said, we learn in English, but we translate things in our mother tongue and Kiswahili sometimes. So when it comes out, it might be different. So it's always good to have that. And then I would involve everybody in my class because we all learn differently and we are gifted differently. So I would use that later on. And it will be part of the buy-in so that everybody feels part of the process. And then it will be definitely participatory because, of course, participatory means co-creation. You know, we are co-creating together, we are participating, we are co-creating this together. And then I would decide if the students, some of them are co-editors or translators, because as I said, I think it's important to harness the wealth of the diversity of the knowledge of the students or the learners that you have in the space. So I would ask who's comfortable with this, who's comfortable with that, and I would keep just a few of them, not everything, for them to do, because of course you always need someone outside of the creators to look at it. The other thing that I would harness the know-how of the learners is, you see where there's the illustrators, the, you know, those things that are done, or even the, you know, the things that are done that are creative, you know, like the images or whatever it is that you want to do in there, or typesetting, that kind of thing. And then I don't like structured things because they make me feel like I'm in a closed place. So I would invite everyone and see what happens in terms, you know, I would invite everybody, then everything is thrown there, then we put it together again. And then I think people like when they get some credits for their course. I think money is good, but if it's an institution of higher learning, like credit, to take forward to something that they are working on, or one of their whatever. Yeah. So institutional challenge, that I will bring it at the beginning and at the end, because if the institution does not say yes, then nothing ever happens. You know, they keep on going around and, oh, it has to be approved by the dean. It has to be approved by the vice dean, the vice chancellor. It has to be approved by someone else, the head of department. Then by the time you are finished, a year is gone. So that's my take. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Well done for getting through the whole process. That's fantastic. We're going to talk more about the roles and but especially that kind of structured idea and the power as well as we go through. And hopefully end off with a little bit of discussion around institutional challenges, because I think that is something that we cannot ignore. Te, somebody new has arrived. You're welcome to listen in. Okay, so when I was talking about the kind of the purpose and the context, I think definitely, the multilingualism aspect is something very exciting that's going to be happening in future. I think it's going to make so many more resources accessible. And I think AI is probably going to have quite a bit to do with that. So not only the key terms, like Danielle was saying, terms in STEM, but also actually just translating resources, like Spanish resources to English and English to Spanish and so on. And, just one example, but just, across the world where we can actually have that translation and more access to more materials. So I think multilingualism is quite exciting. When I was talking about curriculum change, and I think that was really interesting what you said, Danielle, about, the open textbook is content. Textbook is content that goes with the course. But it's been an interesting journey that we've as we've been doing this, we've realized that the content is important, but it's the process that's so exciting. So it's about bringing students in, bringing other collaborators in, sharing ideas. And so although the content is important at the end, the content is so much richer because of being able to bring in more voices than you could have before. If you were, authoring on your own, or maybe one or two peers. So the process is very important. And so it does kind of fit in with this idea of curriculum change, because even though it might be a textbook that sits with the curriculum and content, often it's more powerful because you can bring in so many more voices, and so therefore it can be part of curriculum change. And sometimes that's just in a course, and sometimes we've seen examples of curriculum across departments where academics have been looking at not only the teaching, not only the pedagogy, but also the content and how those materials can be changed to be more relevant to the students, the current day students. And, it's something as educators that we need to be thinking about all the time is how relevant are our materials and how useful are they to the students in our classroom? And can our students in the classroom really relate to what's actually in the resource? So that's great. Okay. And what other, so, and different ways of approaching getting into Bovel's categories, Catherine Bovel's categories about engagement and how you would actually bring students in. So that was also useful. Any questions or comments at this point before we move on to the next little bit? Great. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. And then we can talk about okay, now I'm on that slide. Much further along. Great. Okay, so that's great. So that was the first kind of steps into thinking about your approach, how you might think about an approach and what would be important to you if you're thinking about co-creation with students. And what we saw was, if we look at those first categories as being kind of almost high-level participation, within that co-creation or participatory design, there are also these really interesting roles that students have taken up. And this is from our initiatives at UCT. So we have authors, we have co-editors, and we have translators. So we were talking about that the idea of translation. But when we started to look at it, it was fascinating how many different roles came in. And this is a long list, and I'm not expecting you to kind of remember all of this. And in fact, it's a list that we want to grow as we go through it. But there's so many different ways of thinking what students could potentially do in this idea of creating an open textbook. Or looking at your course materials, for example, if not an open textbook, maybe your actual course materials. And really exciting things that came out of conversations with the authors about what the students were doing. So proposing relevant materials, testing the content to see if it's understandable, reviewing, and this specific comment here, reviewing to eliminate expert blind spots, was actually a phrase that was used and when we were doing our research. Students could be brought in to design quizzes. Students were brought in to look at the concept and approach to layout. Students were brought in for typesetting, proofreading, assisting in a whole bunch of different ways: editorial, technical, curatorial, administrative aspects, so assisting in various ways, and then also obviously collaborating. And then we had some others that have sort of come up and we've added onto that list. So I'm not going to go into all of them, but I mean, one that Irene mentioned was this idea of an illustrator. So there's so many different ways of bringing students in. It's all about deciding how you can do that and just how much you want to bring them in, how much or how little you want to bring them in. But there are lots of opportunities to be able to bring students in, which is exciting. So that's a long list there. Okay, so to just move a little bit now into kind of a little bit more about some of the advantages and the complexity of co-creation that I wanted to just kind of highlight. So in this kind of process that I've been setting out, where we were looking at open education, example of open textbooks, social justice, and co-creation, we started to think about the values and principles that underlie all of these aspects. So what underlies social justice? What are the principles underlying co-creation? And what are the principles underlying belonging? And we could see that there were a number of overlaps that we wanted to explore further. So we also, again, went and read a number of different authors have written about student belonging. And very importantly, that student belonging is a key aspect of student success. So well worth exploring, because we want our students to be successful, stay in our institution and get through their degrees. And so the sense of belonging, the principles are around care and mutual respect and trust. And these are principles that are also sort of underlying in co-creation, but also underlying social justice. And there's a number of interesting articles. This one here by Leroux and Groenewald. They talk about breaking down barriers so that students are involved with peers and staff and the curriculum in order to kind of bring them in and make them feel a sense of belonging. And when we were interviewing authors who were writing, who had students, that were working with them, they talked about things of how the students could feel valued because their expertise was important. If they didn't have their expertise, they wouldn't have been able to write the textbook. And this kind of really interesting relationship that started to happen between the students and the staff as they were co-creating, and helping to build a sense of belonging for students. And so we sort of started to kind of build this kind of cycle of related aspects, and talked about, yeah, some of the, and then on the outside is some of the tensions actually. And so I do want to surface those, because I think if we're going to be thinking about co-creation, that's wonderful, but we know that that's not always that easy. So the lessons learned are also very important. And in the top right-hand corner, the point about institutional culture is very important. So in the institution where you're working, what is the culture? Is it a culture of embracing co-creation with students, or is it very much still a sort of traditional university where perhaps that wouldn't be supported? And how would you overcome that if you wanted to start initiatives like this? We've also seen that all of this work takes a lot of time. If you are including colleagues and students in creation of materials, it takes much longer than it would have taken if you just sat down and worked intensively for a few weeks. What you get is much richer, and this process, as we've shown, that can address injustices, build a sense of belonging. But realistically, it does take time. Collaboration does take time. And then in terms of co-creation, in the bottom left, this idea of control over what's happening, and like how much do you really tell the students what they must do, or how much freedom do they have? And then in the top corner is a comment around what some of the academics were talking about, was that they felt that the students were actually mentoring them, and that the students knew so much about certain areas that they did not know about, and almost kind of a role reversal in a way, or definitely a kind of a balancing of agency in some situations, not all situations. And so this is kind of what I wanted us to also just have a sort of similar kind of just think about how you would engage with students, but also just to problematize this idea of power dynamics, because they exist. There's no doubt, unless you're in a very special institution, there are traditional power differences between lecturers and students. And sometimes it's difficult to then build a culture of partnership. And so this is important and something for us to be thinking about. And so I just wanted to give you 3 examples that you could be thinking about, and they are in that activity too, in the engagement approach. And interesting, because when we were looking at the examples, initially when we looked, we were like, these are amazing, the students have equal agency, and the lecturers were talking about student agency, but it was more complicated than that. So 3 examples. 1 and 2, we're calling a tilting of power. So not a shift in power, just a slight kind of tilt. Author 1 included the whole class. Okay, so we only had 1 example of that, where the whole class was brought in to create pages of her open textbook. But she said there was real structure. So she gave the students a particular template that they had to work with. And even once they'd done that, she edited that quite extensively. So although the students could choose a little bit of the content and could work on the text and so on, they didn't have that much agency, actually. They couldn't be really creative and do something different or make decisions that were outside of this kind of template. So hence the structure aspect. But she also says it would have been difficult if she didn't have the structure with the whole class. So there is that kind of, there's this, that's what I'm talking about, this tilting and this balancing is not that easy. Author 2 selected excellent students. So top of the class students, because he needed certain things to be done. So he wanted students to do technical stuff, students to build assessment, and he knew that these students could do it. So he says, oh, my approach was free form, but he is dealing with students that were top students and already very engaged. And then sometimes you are, as a result, excluding other students that are not top students, and so on. So a different kind of approach seemed to be very free form, but then actually it was because he was using very, very, very clever students. And then a third approach, which we thought was very interesting, where the author, came into the classroom, I think 70 to 80 students, and told them about the open textbook and invited them in. Would you like to be part of this? You don't have to do it at all. If you do it, you're going to have attribution and so on. It's going to be great. Yeah, so amazing. And so his approach was about getting buy-in and shifting students into getting them more and more involved as they went along. So he doesn't think of the categories that we've talked about with Bovel, where it's either one or the other, but he feels it's more freeform. So you start off with more of a light touch, but you keep engaging the students with the hope that ultimately they will all be co-creating. And he was one of the lecturers that was really humbled by the students' knowledge and expertise. So 3 very different approaches. And obviously there'll be lots of variations of that of those 3. So I wanted just for a little while, just a little bit by yourself. I know, Irene, you were way ahead of everyone and went into actually talking about and thinking about engagement approach. But maybe now that I've kind of talked about it a little bit, you might have a few minutes to just think about it again. But yeah, so sharing power is important. Again, it's important for belonging. And so I just wanted you to kind of reflect on how you may approach this, but then also, do you have any concerns or feelings about giving students the power to co-create materials? And then maybe kind of what your thoughts are about co-creation and building a sense of belonging. And if that's something that you feel that there is a relationship between. So again, I'm going to give you 5 minutes or so just to have a little bit of quiet time. You can look at the little at the Google Doc if you want to, or you can just be thinking about these particular headings, and then we're going to be talking about power and reflecting on power. Okay, so I'm going to keep quiet for 5 minutes or so. Any questions at this stage? Oh, okay. Irene has to leave. Okay. Danielle, given the importance of the process, I wonder if it's important to train students to work together so that they know how to discuss issues in constructive rather than conflictual ways. Very interesting. I don't know if that was done in any of the examples that I have. But certainly what I've seen is that there is a lot of workshopping in the beginning about how to collaborate together. And I think students do a lot of group work and collaborative work, but there's no doubt that you have to manage those tensions. Others? Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to just think about these questions. And power and how you would work with students, and what you think about those different scenarios maybe as well. Anyone can go ahead.
I can go ahead because I unfortunately have to excuse myself after that, so I'll just
Okay.
share before I go.
Okay.
When it comes to power, especially in the classroom, actually two things come to mind. The first one, and particularly with maybe the younger age students, primary and so forth, is classroom rules.
Yes.
I feel sometimes the teacher has to come up with some sort of compromise for both the teacher and students together to come up with the classroom rules and agree on it, rather than being enforced on the students without listening to what they think about it as well. So it needs to be a mutual agreement in that sense. And another thing when it comes to power, and this may be for higher education students more specifically, is with grading. And the grading scale and how this is done and who deserves the A and who's the A- student. And this actually, I mean, also needs to be addressed as an issue with students who have a grade-centric mindset as well. I mean, this has to be cultivated from the very start. They come to university or to school to learn more than just coming for the grade. So this is a whole mindset that needs to be tackled as well. But there is some form of power dynamics in that sense too. So those are the two things that actually came to mind when it comes to power, especially in the classroom.
That's great, Elia. Thank you so much for your contribution. I know that you have to go. One of the things that we'll definitely I'll definitely share the slides, obviously as part of the process, but that is one of the things that we're going to touch on after this. Like, how do you recognize the students? What is the reward for doing this work? How do you attribute them? And if you're going to grade a student on their work, then there's that power imbalance, because then the lecturer has got control. So there are different views. I'm not suggesting that there's a right or wrong way to do it. It all depends on the context. But definitely there is that relationship between grading and power. And yes, there are students that I will do this work if you give me a mark for it, or if it's part of my mark. If it's not part of my mark, I don't really want to do it. So there's a whole lot of variables and interesting context that we need to explore through this process. And yeah, for some students, recognition may not be enough. They may want to actually have a grade as well, to be part of it. And certainly, I mean, as Irene mentioned, who's left now, the financial, paying a student is really useful. And all students need money. So if you can, that's great. But mostly we can't. We're not in a situation where we have that money. But I do think that that's also something. But then also there's not that there's a power imbalance through that, but certainly that does change the nature of the relationship. So great. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thanks. Great. Danielle, do you have any thoughts about this power relationship, if you're thinking about co-creation?
I think, you talked a little bit about the institutional culture and how that colors things. So if we're in K-12, my Canadian is that the power, the culture would be one of where, okay, the teacher's the boss and they decide and they guide the students through. If it's in higher education, then you can have a greater variety of, is it reverence of the students towards the teacher? And are you at the first year of university, or are you doing this project with PhD students in the final year of their program? So I think these things all need to be considered. When it comes to, okay, well, just to continue on the discussion you were just having, it's from the start, what are the students getting out of this? So is this I think there's a few things to consider. You know, is this work of building this OER, is it done on school study time? Are they getting a grade? Are they getting financial compensation? Like, what are they getting out of it? Are they having to put in personal time? If that's the case, more privileged students are likely to benefit from the project and be involved. So these are a few things to consider. And if the students are guided well, maybe they'll take only the required amount of time to do something. But some students, especially, I would guess, younger students who aren't used to studying effectively, you know, they might not know how to research a topic, for example, so they might spend 10 hours doing something, whereas with the right technique, they could have spent just 1 hour doing it. So I think that's important. I think it's important to equip the students so that they know how to do the job. But yeah, what do students get out of it? I mean, if they're volunteering, then the power shifts a little bit, because if they're volunteering, then they have the power to leave. But if this is a part of required work, then that's different. And I think power within can change. So let's say you have a structure where, to begin, you have, you know, let's say you have 5 groups, and in each group you have an author, you have a reviewer. Okay, so at the beginning, the author and researcher, I suppose, have the greatest power because they're the ones doing the actual work. And then when the work is passed on to the student who is a reviewer, well, that person holds the power, because if they want to modify the content, well, maybe they'll do it in consultation with the author, or maybe they'll work on their own and change things the way they like. And therefore, hopefully, your tool allows for going back in time. If it doesn't, this is where the ed tech part comes in to influence the power. You know, maybe the student uses the technology such that, the history of the document is gone. I am the reviewer. I've decided this is how it's going to be. And so, yeah. And also, let's say you have these 5 groups and they rotate. So in the first, let's say the students have worked in a group for a month. Now in the second month, you know, they were working on one chapter, and now they're working on a different chapter in the second month. So whoever was the author before is no longer. And so they change roles, and so they see the different challenges of different roles. So they are made to be more empathic with people who are holding these different roles. So I think this kind of thing is a way to change power throughout the semester or throughout the project, and perhaps build more community as the project grows.
Great.
I'm just thinking about power, but not inside the classroom, as opposed to how we would co-create with students. As I'll talk about it from a student, not from a student perspective, but from someone who sits on the fence and feels the inclination towards higher education. So there is this whole idea of equity from that part of view as a faculty member when you choose students who work with you. So do you assume the injustices that the students are already struggling with? I mean, do you assume, yeah, as you said, the financial need of students? Do you see the pressing bills that the students need to respond to and need to attend to? And then when you choose your students, also, do you assume the representation? And you've kind of touched on political representation earlier. And I mean here, did you assume that including people with kind of disabilities to ensure accessibility in the project or not, or in the open textbook? Because as long as it's an open textbook, it's kind of, you know, we have to, it's open textbook, it's open licensed, and it's less monitored when it comes to the digital accessibility checkups. So all these are related to power, because you are the one who will end up choosing these, and you are the one who will end up working through the groups and the reviewer, the tester, the author as well, if you're kind of a supervisor and you're not into the project yourself. So it's I'm considering myself, you know, and I've got a big interest in joining one of these myself even. So I'm considering, okay, if I have these documents and they are kind of inaccessible, it's an extra labor for me that I'll need to go and make them accessible first before I work with them. And these are just few thoughts that came to mind when it comes to power. And this is what I myself, and please correct me if I'm kind of wrong, what I think it's called internal power, because this is not really present in the classroom. This is kind of present in yourself, and we have to all admit and acknowledge that we all have our internal biases, because I might not be the right fit to choose this student because they are so and so and so, and this is kind of inadvertent and an accidental. We all have it, and we all kind of learn how to go through it. I don't know to what extent to agree and disagree with me on these few thoughts, but yeah, this is how I thought about it. I hope yeah.
That's excellent, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the others can respond. We haven't heard from Che yet. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. These are really complex things. I mean, the disability access is very, very important. And we have examples where that was considered, and also some publication platforms do really help us with that, where they can actually build in, a lot of the accessibility aspects. But I think that when you were talking, I kind of suddenly felt this burden of responsibility to be able to think about all these different things is not that easy. And that's why it is about your context and what your purpose is. And to kind of make everybody satisfied, and you've got to just try and do the best job you can, but to try and get everyone involved and do all of those kinds of things, not that easy. And so we've got examples where there were different kinds of interventions, and people authors did things in different ways according to what they could do in their situation, and some to lesser and other degrees as to how much equity they actually included, how they included the students, and what they were thinking about in the end product.
There is this whole argument about an institutional systemic power, that you have a manager, then a vice manager, then the ruler goes, the ladder goes on. I mean, so this also can impact. This is another type of power that can impact like the student choice, because you're not working in your own universe, and therefore you might have some restrictions on that. But I'll also come back to what you had said, because you've said a very important word, which is responsibility towards thinking about it. Like this whole argument of marginalization, we can design sessions about it, because the idea of we work with people from there are lots of types of marginalizations when it comes to whoever, like who are you gonna direct yourself to, and if you're working with white people, I don't want to go into the argument, but if you're working with white people, and then these white people have a kind of a privilege in terms of the education they received, the financial capability, they are kind of in the economic stability. But if you're working with someone from Africa who might need the few dollars, as I said, money is really important to students. Students commute, students work, and as I said, accessibility, like the testing of accessibility is I can sometimes work on a document manually, and I have, before even reading what is inside that document, I kind of work on it manually to fix the mistakes that result in from the OCR technologies. So responsibility should underlie what the work is about, and how it's being represented. All of that, with all what you said when it comes to representation and political and voice and all of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know if I
Great.
have much to add.
Okay.
The conversation is interesting because I'm just wrapping up kind of the first version of an OER, and then in the fall, I'm going to engage with students in creating some new chapters for it.
Oh, great.
So I really wanted to be here for the whole session, but this is an interesting thing because the conversation of power is very much in my head right now, because what I'm going to do is I have a course where the students do community engaged learning projects, but it's become too difficult for me to manage 10 different projects. And so my solution is to have some of the groups working on internal projects like creating chapters for the textbook. And so it has this really, like, I'm like, are students going to want to sign up for the textbook chapters? Are they going to only want to work with the external partners because they see more value in that? And so I'm trying to figure out how I can almost sell the text, like working on the textbook chapters to the students, but still make sure that, I mean, my thought is that the book is for the intro course, so they will have all done the intro course.
Mhm.
And so like, this is their chance to improve the course for the next
Yeah.
group of students. So yeah, this idea of power is very much in my brain right now. So this conversation is helpful. So thank you, everyone.
That's excellent. That's great. I'm going to talk a little bit about that kind of recognition and stuff now on this last little piece. I've added in the chat. I don't know if you got the Google Doc. Okay. So that might also be just helpful in fleshing out some of your thinking as well, in terms of how you thinking, the kind of models of how you're thinking to engage students in the textbooks, in your textbook. That's great. Sounds exciting. I'm just going to share my screen again. Okay, so that was activity 2. Okay, so this is just this last little section. And yeah, I'm hoping I should have time to show you a student video, which is quite inspiring, I thought. So part of this, the very important part of all of this is how to recognize the students and give attribution for their work. And, you know, it's important, we know it's important because it's part of scholarly practice. And it gives credibility to the work. And it's only through this attribution that if we are attributing students that they can actually get that form of recognition. So it's very important that even if you're using a student in a small way, one of those roles, but it was kind of just in a very kind of light touch way, to still give attribution and recognition. And this idea of this recognition that as a student, you were part of this, creating this chapter, whatever the particular role was, and you get recognized for it, there is a correlation between how students feel about that and a sense of belonging and value in the department wherever they are, you know, as part of the course, that what they've done has actually been an important contribution. And you know, as you said, students might have been through the course already and now they're improving and getting a newer version. So what are they giving to future students, you know, and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of kind of reciprocity that can be built into the argument for why they should be doing it. Yeah, and so when we're busy doing an article at the moment where we're talking about that how the lecturers try to build the student's sense of agency and recognition and trust, and with the ultimate goal of student success. And just to get back to something that Danielle was saying earlier about time that students have, and this would be something that's relevant, Tay, to what you are thinking, in that this issue of students have limited time. And we found that all the authors that we, that especially the ones that were very engaged with the students, were very aware of just how to balance it, like not to give students too much work that it's going to be something so overwhelming for them, and how to kind of think about, that idea of, will they be working on the chapters in the class? Will they be working, in their own personal time? How will that impact on the other courses? And so on. So there are lots of little things to think about. If you're going to give them marks, that's maybe different, because then there's another purpose to it. Right, so there's marks for coursework, financial compensation, other compensation like food, t-shirts. We had one group who created stickers, very funky stickers that the students could put onto their laptops, and they were part of kind of this group that had created something. And yeah, the other two at the bottom were not necessarily kind of obvious things that come out, but yeah, there's an interesting example of a student that talks about this. Just kind of a little, yeah. So this is, these are ways of attributing the students. So for example, in the, that whole long list of students, they all just had a small component, but they all got recognition for doing that. They were working in groups, sometimes only on one page with diagrams and information. It was an architecture example. Or for example, here we see in chapter 13 of the product tactics, gift is a student. So you can obviously attribute in different ways. And I think we probably are familiar with Creative Commons, and we don't really need to get, don't need to kind of labor on the point. But yeah, the basic licenses, and it's all about attribution, and then deciding, from there, how you want to use your Creative Commons license. And I think that, citation and attribution is something that we're seeing at our institution, and the work that we're doing lately as being increasingly important, which I think is great. I think it's a good practice thing that should be thought about carefully. And one of the one kind of aspect that's come up is this idea of ChatGPT. And well, not the idea of, but rather how to reference, how to cite ChatGPT. And students being concerned about using ChatGPT and then getting into trouble for it, and how would they be able to reference it, and actually being quite responsible and saying, look, I did use ChatGPT for a first version of this. How do I, how do I cite ChatGPT? So I think it's actually quite nice how this is growing, and it's actually made people aware of plagiarism and of not attributing. Okay, so here's gift.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gift Pala, and I'm in my final year of a business science and finance and accounting here at UCT. So when I was first asked to be a part of the textbook, I took it very lightly, because I told myself that I'm just doing it to make my CV look nice and that it's a real bonus that I'm going to get a reference letter from someone with a PhD in business science from being a part of it. And I was also very excited to work with the UCT Liberty Institute, because I'd been blown away by their marketing research on South African income classes and the Black middle class, because this was something that we learned about in our lectures on my degree program. And once I got involved, some of the good parts was having the power to choose examples in explaining marketing concepts, right? So to this day, I still find it unbelievable that there is a textbook out there in the world that consists of examples that are straight up sucked out of my thumb, right? And I also I found that I'm a bit of an expert on product marketing because of it, right? So product marketing is now something that I've worked on throughout my high school and throughout my degree program, and also through research for the textbook. Some of the challenging parts was the amount of reading of textbooks and websites that I had to do during a time that was meant to be my vacation. Imagine, right? And the worst of the worst was having to do the UCT Harvard referencing model for all this research that I did. And another part was a challenge was the many rounds of edit checks that we had to do before publication, right? At some point, I was positive that James Lapperman was pulling my leg with the amount of edit checks that he required me to do, and I was consequently very humbled by the fact that there was actually errors on almost every round that we had to do edit checks. Yeah, and then I think now that it's out, something that I was not ready for is the fame, right? So because I tried to be as discreet as possible among my peers about it, but it's funny how they all just somehow found out. And also, now this is something that my family is very proud of me about. Yeah, and also I think, like, ultimately, I think James would have found it easy to convince me to do this if he had just told me about the fame that was gonna come afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. I love Gift's story, and I think it's really relevant. And I think he touches on so many different aspects, and it was completely just talk about your experience. But yeah, kind of talks to a lot of the aspects that we've discussed today. And so I just wanted to have a little closing chat, really more than anything else, about concerns and what could be exciting here. And then I think, yeah, perhaps some of the obstacles, perhaps some of the concerns about your institution. So really just in closing, just a couple of general comments, I think, about what I was just talking about now, and then perhaps also just some of the concerns that you might have. I'm just going to stop sharing because that is pretty sure that's my last slide. Yes, it is. Hey, did you enjoy Gift's story?
Thank you. Yeah, it was all wonderful. You know, it's very touching, because when you are a student and you are in the same position as people, you kind of feel, okay, that's what people felt. So it's kind of relatable, which is kind of unique that I'm in this position to see how people who are like usually my age and they worked on something like that, and how the experience was kind of fun, was kind of wonderful. Yeah. So I'll just pause the recording here, Glenda. So if people would like to have a kind of a chat over, like, without in this last 20 minutes. Yeah, thanks everybody, and thanks Glenda for this session. It was really insightful, and thank you.